San Antonio, Texas, July 2015. After the divorce, 35-year-old Mark Whitman was just trying to rebuild something that looked like a normal life. Work during the week, his son every other weekend, and every time he picked up Dylan from his mother's house, the boy seemed a little quieter than before, so Mark booked a few nights at a mid-range hotel, just the two of them. Swimming pool, cartoons, pancakes in the lobby, something to make his son smile again. But by the second night, Mark noticed something wasn't right. Dylan woke up crying. Not once. Every night. And each time when Mark asked, the boy just shook his head. He wouldn't speak. That's when Mark decided to act. He placed his old phone on the dresser, angled toward the room. Set it to record video, just in case. He expected maybe a nightmare, a sleep-talking episode. But what the phone captured that night, it changed everything. Not just what he thought of the hotel, but what he thought of the people around him, and who had a key to their room. Mark had driven the entire way from Austin in silence. Only the soft hum of the highway and the occasional shuffle of his son in the back seat breaking the monotony. Dylan hadn't spoken much on the trip. He rarely did these days. Ever since the divorce 6 months earlier, the boy had seemed to fold into himself like a closing book. Mark tried not to take it personally. He knew Dylan was young and that transitions were hard. He had read the books, listened to the podcasts, nodded along when therapists told him that patience was key. But the truth was that every time he looked at his son and saw that quiet blankness where a spark used to live, it felt like failure in slow motion. The hotel was an attempt at something new. Not grand, not expensive, but a break from routine. He chose Valencia Suites because it had a pool, breakfast waffles, and good reviews that spoke of cleanliness and comfort. Room 207 was on the second floor, facing a row of half-empty parking spaces and a dented soda machine. The carpet was dark blue and slightly frayed at the edges, the bedspreads patterned with muted stripes. There were 2 queen beds, a TV bolted to the dresser, and a bathroom with towels folded into triangles. Mark set Dylan's backpack on one bed and dropped his own overnight bag on the other. He tried to lighten the mood, pointed out the mini fridge and the vending machine down the hall. Dylan offered a faint smile, but said nothing. He moved toward the bed with his stuffed owl tucked under one arm and climbed up without removing his shoes. Mark ordered pizza, let Dylan pick the cartoon channel, and brought up the idea of swimming. Dylan shook his head and kept his eyes on the TV. Mark told himself it was okay, that kids needed time, that maybe after dinner, or maybe tomorrow, the fog would lift, but deep down he felt it, the cold distance between them, a quiet chasm that no amount of small talk or pool time seemed to cross. That first night, Dylan fell asleep early. Mark read a story aloud, even though the boy's eyes were already closed halfway through the second page. He left the bedside, lamp on just in case, and lay in the other bed scrolling through emails, pretending he wasn't watching his son breathe. Around 2:14 a.m., Mark woke up to a soft sound. It wasn't loud, just a muffled whimper. He turned and saw Dylan curled into a tight ball, whispering something into his owl. Mark got up, sat beside him, gently rubbed his back until the boy calmed. When asked, Dylan said nothing. Only looked past his father toward the window as if expecting something. Mark stayed there until Dylan's breathing evened out again, then returned to bed. He brushed it off as a bad dream. New place, unfamiliar shadows, it made sense. The second night followed the same pattern. Dylan was quiet during the day, refused the pool, barely touched his pancakes at breakfast. Mark took him to the nearby zoo, hoping the animals might coax a laugh or even a question. But Dylan remained subdued, walking with his hand in Mark's, eyes downcast. That night, Mark left the lamp on again. Around 2:12 a.m., he was pulled from sleep by soft crying. Dylan, this time, sat upright in bed, rocking slightly. Mark hurried over, held him, whispered reassuring nonsense. Dylan didn't resist, but he didn't speak either. His eyes were wide open, fixed on the darkened bathroom door. When morning came, Mark asked if he wanted to go home. Dylan shook his head. Mark didn't know if that was a good sign or not. He checked the door locks. Twice. Everything was secure. The chain, the deadbolt, the extra latch. Still, he couldn't shake the chill that ran down his spine every time Dylan glanced toward a shadowed corner, like he was waiting for something. Or someone. On the third night, Dylan insisted on sleeping with the owl clutched tightly to his chest. His posture was tense even in sleep. Around the same time, shortly after 2, and he whimpered again. This time Mark sat awake, already expecting it. He listened, watching the dim outlines of the room, the subtle movement of the air conditioner, curtain, the red glow of the alarm clock. When Dylan settled again, Mark remained sitting, unease creeping into his gut. Something wasn't right. He told himself it was just the strain of parenting alone, the guilt of the divorce. But deep inside, another voice spoke. The voice that wakes you up before danger arrives. The voice that doesn't need evidence to know when something is off. He couldn't explain why the towel on the counter had been folded differently than he remembered, or why the lamp that he knew he had left on was off when he woke up. They were small things. Insignificant, maybe. But the pattern was there, subtle and unnerving. And Dylan, the way his eyes followed the mirror, the way he tensed when the room got dark, Mark couldn't ignore it anymore. This was supposed to be a small getaway, a quiet attempt at healing. Instead, it felt like something was watching them, and whatever it was, only came out when the lights were off. The following morning unfolded like any other, at least on the surface. The sun filtered through the beige curtains, casting a muted glow across the hotel room's patterned carpet. Mark stirred first, his body aching slightly from the stiff mattress. He sat up slowly, rubbed his face, and turned to check on Dylan. The boy was curled on his side, arms tightly wrapped around his owl, breathing slow and even. For a moment, everything looked normal. But as Mark rose and stepped toward the bathroom, his foot brushed against something on the floor. It was Dylan's small backpack, except Mark was sure he had left it on the table last night, zipped up and untouched. Now it sat on the floor, slightly open, with one of Dylan's t-shirts poking out. He paused, then shook it off. Maybe the boy had gotten up during the night. Maybe he moved it himself. Still, the feeling in Mark's gut didn't go away. He walked into the bathroom and turned on the light. The towel that had been hanging neatly on the hook was now folded, resting on the edge of the sink. A small thing, easy to explain. Maybe he had done it himself and forgotten, but the feeling persisted. He washed his face and looked at himself in the mirror. Tired eyes, unshaven jaw, a man running on instinct and caffeine. He turned off the light and stepped back into the room. As Dylan woke, Mark tried to go about the morning as usual. He offered cartoons, suggested waffles in the lobby, mentioned maybe going to the aquarium that afternoon. Dylan answered in nods or soft grunts, never quite making eye contact. He seemed distracted, almost like he was listening for something Mark couldn't hear. They made their way down to breakfast, and while Dylan pushed his food around the plate, Mark kept watching him, the way his shoulders tensed when someone behind them spoke too loudly, the way he kept glancing at the windows even though the curtains were drawn. It was like the boy was waiting. But for what? Later that afternoon, while Dylan napped, Mark sat in the armchair beside the bed, staring at the mirror across from them. It was large, framed in faux wood, slightly tilted downward as if it had been adjusted. Mark couldn't remember it pointing that way the day they checked in. He got up, walked over, and reached behind the frame, curious. Dust, wires, nothing unusual. Still, it left him uneasy. Something about the angle, the way the reflection seemed to warp the room ever so slightly, made him feel watched, a sensation he'd dismissed in the first 2 days, but now couldn't shake. That evening, Mark stepped out briefly to grab snacks from the vending machine. He was gone maybe 5 minutes. When he returned, Dylan was sitting stiffly on the bed, wide-eyed, hugging his owl. The lamp on the nightstand, which had been on when Mark left, was now off. Dylan didn't say a word. Mark flicked the light back on and sat beside him, trying not to show the sudden surge of dread in his chest. He checked the door, still locked. The latch still set, the chain still hooked, the window was shut tight. Yet somehow, something felt wrong. As the night wore on, Dylan grew more restless. He didn't speak much during dinner, barely touched his food. And when it came time to get ready for bed, he hesitated near the mirror, looking at it as though expecting it to move. Mark noticed the way Dylan arranged his blanket, tucked tightly around himself, the owl pressed against his chest like a shield. The boy kept glancing toward the door, then the mirror, then the darkened bathroom beyond. His eyes darted around the room like he was keeping track of invisible things. Mark left the bedside lamp on again, despite the growing sense that it didn't matter. He lay awake longer than usual, listening. At 2:11 a.m., Dylan shifted under the blankets. Mark sat up. This time the boy didn't cry. He just sat upright slowly, breathing heavy, staring at the mirror again. He didn't speak, just stared. When Mark whispered to him, the boy didn't respond. He was alert, aware, but silent, as though locked in place by some invisible presence. The next morning, Mark checked his phone's alarm and noticed something else. It had been unplugged. The charger cord lay coiled on the floor beside the table. He hadn't moved it. He was certain of that. His stomach twisted. Too many small things now. The towel, the backpack, the lamp, the charger. None of them proof. But together they painted a picture. A pattern. One he didn't want to believe. One that whispered of intrusion, of presence, of something just out of sight. He walked down to the front desk under the pretense of needing more towels. While the receptionist turned to check the supply closet, Mark casually asked how many employees had access to guest rooms after hours. The answer was vague. Only the night staff, a cleaning supervisor, and a manager. Mark nodded, thanked them, and returned to the room with the towels in hand, but his mind spinning. That afternoon, Dylan refused to leave the room. He said nothing, simply sat on the bed and traced circles on his owl's wing with his thumb. Mark didn't push. Instead, he sat in the chair and watched the room. He watched the door, the mirror, the way shadows crept across the carpet as the daylight dimmed. He didn't know what he was looking for, but he knew something was off. Something was wrong. And he wasn't going to sleep again until he knew what. Mark spent the entire afternoon in a fog of suspicion that wouldn't let go. Every movement, every creak of the air conditioner, every shuffle from the hallway outside their door made his skin tighten. He didn't share any of it with Dylan, of course. The boy was already retreating inward more and more with each passing hour, and the last thing Mark wanted to do was validate his fears. Or worse, share his own. But something had shifted. It wasn't just a father's paranoia anymore. It was a growing certainty, invisible yet undeniable, that they weren't alone. Or if they were, it hadn't been the case every night. After they returned from a quiet lunch downstairs, Mark pretended to scroll through emails on his laptop, while Dylan curled up under the covers with his stuffed owl. The television played something lighthearted in the background, but neither of them was paying attention. Mark kept glancing at the room, at the mirror, the corners, the shadows under the bed, and then at the clock. A plan was forming in his head, not fully articulated yet, but it came from instinct. He needed to stop guessing. He needed to know. When evening arrived, Mark made a quiet decision. He dug through his bag and pulled out his old Samsung phone, the one with the cracked corner of the screen and terrible battery life. It had long since been replaced with a newer model, but he kept it charged for emergencies. Tonight, it would serve a different purpose. He plugged it in by the nightstand and tested the camera. Grainy, low light, barely passable in quality. But it worked. That was all he needed. He propped it up behind a tissue box angled just enough to face both beds and part of the door. The screen was dimmed, notifications off. When it began recording, the red timer in the corner counted quietly upward, unseen. He didn't tell Dylan anything. There was no reason to make the boy even more anxious. Instead, he went about the bedtime routine like it was any other night. They brushed their teeth. He read a short story. He left the lamp on. The difference this time was internal. Mark's heart thudded with purpose as he double-checked the phone's position. From the angle it sat, it would capture most of the room, the beds, the mirror, part of the hallway outside the bathroom, and the front door if it opened. It wasn't perfect, but it would do. As Dylan fell asleep, his body curled away from the door, Mark remained still in his bed. He lay facing, the phone feigning sleep. Every minute dragged like an hour. At some point, fatigue pulled at the edges of his awareness, but his body remained tense, rigid, as if wired directly into the nervous anticipation of what the night might reveal. The red digits on the bedside clock blinked methodically. 1:58, 2:03, 2:10. Mark barely breathed. At 2:12, Dylan stirred. 12, Dylan. Not the restless tossing from the first nights, but a quiet, alert shift. The boy opened his eyes, blinked at the ceiling, and then turned to face the mirror. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He simply watched. And Mark, resisting the urge to sit up, let his gaze drift carefully across the room. The mirror caught his attention first, the way it reflected the light of the lamp into a warped, almost distorted frame of the boy's bed. There was nothing unusual in the moment, no movement, no sound beyond Dylan's breathing, but something in the air felt charged, like the calm that came before a sudden change in pressure, like the world was holding its breath. Mark didn't move for the rest of the night. The phone recorded everything. No knocks at the door, no voices in the hallway. Yet the tension didn't leave the room. It thickened. The next morning, Mark waited until Dylan was in the shower before retrieving the phone. He sat at the small table near the window, coffee cooling beside him, and watched the footage. At first, there was nothing out of the ordinary. A few minutes of silence. Shifting bedsheets. Dylan rolling over. The glowing red numbers of the clock visible in the background. Mark fast-forwarded in 10-minute increments until something caught his eye. Around 2:14 a.m., the room darkened slightly, not from a light turning off, but as if something had blocked the lamp's beam momentarily. He rewound and played that segment again. The door. It moved. Not fully opened, but enough. A shift in the shadows near the base. A subtle displacement of air. Barely visible unless you were looking for it. But Mark was. He stared, pulse quickening, as the door cracked open 3 inches. 4. Then a slow push until it widened just enough for someone, to slip through. A shape entered, not clearly defined in the grainy video but undeniably human. Tall, slow-moving. Wearing what looked like a pale shirt or uniform. The figure stood in the middle of the room for nearly 20 seconds. Then it stepped forward, toward the bed. Not Mark's, Dylan's. Mark stopped the video, heart in his throat. He sat frozen, hand hovering over the screen, then pressed play again. The figure paused at Dylan's side. Still. Motionless. No bending down. No reaching out. Just standing and watching. Then, with no warning, the figure turned slightly, almost as if sensing something, and looked directly into the lens of the recording phone. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't fast, but it was direct. Like it knew. Like it had always known. Then it stepped back, slowly retreated, and disappeared through the crack in the door. Mark stopped the video and stared at the frozen frame. The timestamp read 2:17 a.m. He didn't move for a long time. The noise of the shower running in the background barely registered. The coffee had gone cold. The room felt suddenly smaller, the walls closer, the light dimmer, even though the bulb above him hadn't flickered. A cold sweat clung to his neck. He had proof, not of a crime, yet, but of presence, of entry, of intention, and that changed everything. Mark sat hunched at the edge of the hotel room table, the small phone cradled in both hands, its cracked screen glowing faintly in the morning light. Outside the window, the world continued like nothing had happened. Cars moved through the parking lot. The sky over San Antonio was cloudless and calm. Somewhere down the hallway, a housekeeping cart rolled by with a soft squeak and the clink of bottles. But inside room 207, time had stopped. The video file he had recorded during the night now sat paused at 2:14 a.m., a frozen frame where the door was ajar. The gap was only a few inches and the light from the hallway barely spilled in. But that opening, that space where no opening should have been, carried a weight that words couldn't describe. He pressed play. The door inched wider. It was slow, methodical, silent. If there had been any sound, the cheap microphone on the phone didn't catch it. The gap widened to perhaps 6 inches, then 8. There was a beat of stillness, then movement. A figure entered the room. Not a blur, not a shadow, not an illusion. A person. Tall, upright, and controlled in every motion. They moved with eerie confidence, like someone who had been in this space before, like someone who knew exactly where they were going. The graininess of the footage blurred the edges, but Mark could still make out a pale shirt, dark pants, and what appeared to be a small badge on the chest, the standard attire for hotel maintenance or housekeeping. But this wasn't a scheduled visit. There had been no knock, no request for entry, and whoever this was, they weren't holding cleaning supplies or equipment. Their hands were empty. Deliberately so. The figure stopped at the threshold for a long moment as if listening, then stepped forward 1 foot in front of the other, slow and unhurried. Not toward Mark's bed. Toward Dylan's. Mark's throat tightened as he watched the figure move closer to the child. Dylan didn't stir. The boy remained curled under the blanket, clutching his stuffed owl, his small back facing the intruder. The figure stopped beside the bed and stood completely still. Seconds passed. Then more. Mark counted in his head. 1, 2, 3, 10, 15, 20. The figure didn't move. No reaching down, no gesture, just standing over the sleeping child with an unnatural stillness that made the footage even more disturbing than if there had been violence. Because this stillness spoke of something calculated, something wrong, something deeply, sickeningly intentional. Then slowly the figure turned their head. Not their body, just the head, as if sensing something. The face came into view, barely lit by the soft bedside lamp and distorted by the low resolution of the phone camera. It wasn't clear. Mark couldn't make out features, but there was enough. The pale of the skin, the shape of the jaw, the curve of the mouth that for a split second seemed to tighten into a smirk or twitch. Then the eyes, dark and unreadable, locked directly onto the camera. The phone hadn't made a sound. The screen had been dark. There was no way this person should have known they were being recorded, and yet, in that moment, they knew. That single glance, held for a breath, maybe 2, sent a jolt of cold through Mark's spine. He felt it in his chest like a punch. The figure stared at the lens, unmoving. Then, as if satisfied, they turned slowly and backed away. They didn't turn their back on the bed. They didn't look at the child. Just slowly stepped backward until they disappeared through the open door. The door remained slightly ajar for a few seconds longer, then gently pulled closed. It never latched. The room returned to stillness. The video ended 10 minutes later with no further movement. No explanation. No second entry. Mark replayed the sequence 3 more times. Each time, it became more real, more unbearable. The details burned themselves into his memory. The angle of the figure's shoulders, the way their shoes made no sound on the carpet, the eerie awareness in that single glance toward the phone. He paused the video again at the clearest frame of the figure's face. There wasn't enough detail for identification. The poor resolution made it impossible. But the shape, the posture, the build, those things might be recognized by someone. The hotel staff. A manager. Someone had to know who this was. He rose from the chair slowly, phone still in his hand, mind racing. He walked across the room, checked the door. It was locked, the deadbolt set, the chain dangling loose. He stared at the lock, then down at the floor, then at the small red dot of the smoke detector on the ceiling. Was there another way in? Had the intruder had a key? Or was something more complicated happening here? He sat back down, trembling. His thoughts spiraled. Was this the first time? Had it happened the previous nights too without being caught? Had this person stood over his son again and again, unseen? The idea made him nauseous. The fact that the figure hadn't touched the boy made it no less horrifying. The intent alone, to enter, to approach, to stare, was enough to unravel Mark's sense of safety. His fists clenched around the phone. He had the footage. He had proof. But he still didn't know who or why. The rest of the morning passed in a blur. He got Dylan dressed, packed their bags in silence, and tried to remain calm, but his hands shook as he zipped up the suitcase. Dylan noticed but said nothing. His eyes followed Mark around the room like he was studying his father's fear. Mark turned off the lamp, unplugged the phone, and slid it into his pocket. The room felt smaller now, stifling, like its walls held something they shouldn't have seen, something they couldn't unsee. And the worst part was knowing this wasn't just a nightmare. It had happened. Someone had come into their room. Someone had stood over his son. And someone had looked directly at the camera with the calm assurance of a man who knew no one would stop him. Until now. Mark's hands were clenched so tightly around the steering wheel that his knuckles had gone pale. The tires hummed against the pavement as he pulled into the circular drive of the hotel entrance. He had packed their things without thinking, every motion mechanical and urgent. Dylan sat in the back seat, unusually silent, holding his stuffed owl close to his chest. Mark had said little, just that they were going to the front desk before heading home. The boy didn't ask questions, but his eyes followed every movement like he knew something had changed. Mark's stomach twisted as he stepped out of the car, the phone in his pocket feeling heavier with each step. The lobby was quiet. A ceiling fan turned lazily overhead, and the faint hum of morning news drifted from a TV mounted above the fireplace. A woman in a navy blazer stood behind the front desk, flipping through check-in reports. She looked up with the detached politeness of someone who had worked too many night shifts. Mark approached slowly, his mouth dry, his breath shallow. He asked to speak to the manager on duty. The woman blinked at him, then asked if it was about his room. He said it was urgent. She gave a reluctant nod and picked up the phone, murmuring something before motioning to a leather chair near the lobby window. Mark didn't sit. He stood, pacing, his eyes flicking from the reception desk to the elevators to the door of the office down the hall. After several minutes, the manager emerged. He was a man in his late 40s, short-cropped hair, thick glasses, a navy polo with the hotel's logo on the chest. His expression was neutral, professional, but vaguely annoyed, the look of someone expecting to be asked for a refund. Mark followed him into the office, a small room with beige walls, a file cabinet, and a dusty window overlooking the loading area. The door closed with a soft click. The manager gestured to the seat across from his desk, but Mark remained standing. The next part felt like something unfolding out of time. Mark spoke calmly at first, detailing what had happened over the past few nights. The crying, the feeling of something being off. Then the movement of the door, then the video. The manager's expression changed gradually, from dismissive to skeptical to visibly uncomfortable. When Mark pulled out the phone and played the footage, the shift was undeniable. The manager leaned in, eyes narrowing. He watched the screen, silently. He saw the door open. He saw the figure enter. He saw them stand over the child. He saw the glance toward the camera. When the video ended, the room fell into silence. The manager leaned back in his chair slowly, his face drained of color. He asked to see the video again. Mark played it a second time, then a third. By the end, the manager was visibly rattled. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, hands pressed to his mouth. He muttered something about internal policies, about access logs, about security clearances. Then he stood up and said he needed to make a call. Mark sat in the chair, now the adrenaline beginning to wear off. replaced by an icy exhaustion. He stared at the office door, half expecting someone to burst through it, or worse, to recognize the figure from the footage and try to downplay it. But the manager returned, after 10 minutes, holding a clipboard and looking shaken. He admitted that the person in the video appeared to be a man named Victor, an outside contractor who had worked on and off with the hotel for months. Victor had previously done maintenance and janitorial work, but he had been let go nearly 3 weeks ago due to complaints from guests about inappropriate behavior and breach of protocol. Somehow, the manager said, he must have retained his master keycard. Mark couldn't believe what he was hearing. The man had no business being in the hotel, let alone in their room in the middle of the night. The manager's explanations felt thin, like a paper wall hastily taped over a hole in the floor. He assured Mark that the police would be notified, that they would be given the footage. He offered a full refund. He mentioned corporate follow-ups, official apologies, legal action. But Mark didn't care about money or apologies. He wanted to understand how a man who had been fired, a man with no reason to have access to any room, had stood within feet of his sleeping son without anyone noticing, without anyone stopping him. The call to the police was made while Mark sat quietly in the office. An officer arrived within 20 minutes, took a copy of the footage, and spoke with both the manager and Mark. Questions were asked. Descriptions were given. Reports were filed. The officer kept his voice calm, but the look in his eyes said everything. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a lost keycard or a guest in the wrong room. This was a deliberate breach. A man who had returned for a reason, and that reason had been Mark's son. By the time Mark returned to the car, Dylan was dozing in the back seat. The child's head leaned against the window, the owl clutched tightly in his hands. Mark sat behind the wheel, hands resting on his knees, eyes staring at nothing. The weight of what had almost happened, or what could have happened, pressed down on him like a second skin. He glanced back at his son, then at the hotel reflected in the rearview mirror. It looked the same, clean, harmless. But that illusion had been broken now, shattered. He didn't speak during the drive home. Dylan remained quiet too, awake for some stretches, asleep for others, but never once asking where they were going, or why they had left so suddenly. There was a new silence between them now, not the fragile distance of the days before, but something heavier. A knowing. A bond forged not from comfort, but from survival. When they reached the house, Mark carried the bags inside in silence, made lunch without appetite, and let Dylan watch cartoons in the living room. Then he went to the kitchen, set the phone on the table, and copied the footage onto his laptop. He saved it 3 times, on a flash drive, in the cloud, on an external hard drive. He wasn't going to let this vanish. Not now, not ever. Because even if the hotel handled it, even if the police followed through, even if Victor was caught, Mark knew the truth. The system had failed, and it had taken a father, a phone, and a scared child's silence to reveal it. The weeks that followed returned to a rhythm that could almost be called normal. But the word didn't mean what it used to. Life resumed its familiar structure. Mark went back to work, Dylan returned to school, and weekends were once again divided between parents, according to the court agreement. But something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface. There was a silence between them that no longer felt like avoidance or emotional distance. It was a silence born of mutual understanding, of an experience too strange and too fragile to fit neatly into words. They didn't talk about the hotel room. They didn't talk about the figure who stood over Dylan while he slept. They didn't talk about the recording, or the phone, or the fact that someone had entered their space without permission and changed something that could never be put back exactly as it was. But the absence of those conversations didn't mean it was forgotten. Mark watched Dylan more closely now. He noticed how the boy sometimes turned on the bedroom light before entering the room, how he left the closet door open just a crack when it had once always been closed, how he never let go of his stuffed owl, even when it was worn and sagging, the fabric thinning at the edges. Dylan no longer cried in the middle of the night, but Mark would still find him awake sometimes, staring at the ceiling, eyes wide open, not scared exactly, but alert, as though waiting for something that hadn't yet returned. Mark found himself becoming more cautious in small ways. He checked every lock twice before bed. He installed a camera in the hallway outside Dylan's room and another on the front porch. He started researching hotel policies, keycard systems, and guest access protocols. He spoke with police again, provided additional copies of the video, answered follow-up questions. They confirmed that Victor had been arrested after being found loitering outside another hotel across town. No weapons were found on him, no clear plan, but he had been carrying a keycard reader and a blank access card in his backpack. The police report described him as disturbed, possibly mentally ill, but with no violent history. It wasn't enough for closure. The story never made the news. The hotel chain handled it quietly, internally, eager to avoid scandal. They offered Mark a written apology and a settlement agreement, which he declined. Money, he realized, had nothing to do with what had happened. What he wanted was safety, and that couldn't be bought. He kept the video file stored in 3 places. He didn't look at it again, but he couldn't bring himself to delete it. It was the only evidence he had that he hadn't imagined it all, that it wasn't a nightmare, that it had happened. Because sometimes, even in the daylight, that doubt crept in, a strange whisper at the back of his mind that suggested maybe it had all been a misunderstanding, a dream. But then he would look at Dylan's drawings. Dylan had never been especially interested in drawing before. But after the hotel, he began to fill page after page with strange, quiet images. A figure standing in a doorway, a bed with a shape next to it, a red light in the corner of a room. Mark never asked what they meant. He didn't need to. The drawings said enough. Dylan wasn't imagining anything either. He remembered. He just didn't want to speak it aloud. Mark often found himself reliving the moment the figure turned and looked directly into the phone. The memory resurfaced in unexpected moments, in the grocery store, in traffic, during late-night emails. That glance had embedded itself in his consciousness like a splinter that wouldn't dissolve. It wasn't just the act of someone entering their room. It was the calmness, the deliberateness, the sense that whoever it was knew he wouldn't be caught. Or worse, that even if he was, nothing would really stop him. There were days when Mark felt rage rise up in him, white-hot and directionless, not just toward Victor but toward the hotel, the management, the entire framework that allowed someone to access a private room without immediate detection. And then there were days when the rage gave way to fear. Because no matter how many locks he checked or cameras he installed, he couldn't unsee what had happened. He couldn't unknow what he now knew. That vulnerability was real, and it wore the face of routine. That danger could look like anyone, a maintenance worker, a neighbor, a stranger with a badge and a key. Over time, the intensity of it all faded. Not the memory, but the sharp edges of the emotion. Like anything else, it softened with time, sanded down by repetition, by school pickups and shared breakfasts and bedtime stories. But the awareness never left. The knowledge that someone had watched his son while he slept remained like a faint watermark over every quiet evening. Sometimes Mark would wake up before dawn and walk down the hallway just to check Dylan's room. He would push the door open slowly, hear the soft rhythm of breathing, and see the boy curled beneath the covers with the owl clutched to his chest. And for a moment, he would stand in the doorway, exactly the way that figure had. Except he wasn't there to steal anything. He was there to keep everything from being taken again. What stayed with them wasn't just the event. It was the weight of what could have been. It was the narrow margin by which nothing worse had occurred. That narrow escape became a ghost of its own, a presence in the house, a shadow in their interactions, a silent thread woven through the way Mark held his son's hand just a little tighter crossing the street, or the way Dylan looked over his shoulder before closing a door. They survived it. But survival, Mark came to understand, wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of learning how to live with what had been revealed. And what stayed with them was the understanding that evil doesn't always break in. Sometimes it uses a key.